Hello and welcome to The Ask with Wise Azimi and Cliff W. Gilmore. Our guest today is Elliot Ackerman. He's a best-selling and award-winning author of the novels 2034, co-written with Admiral James Stavridis, Red Dress in Black and White, Waiting for Eden, Dark at the Crossing, and Green on Blue. Elliot is also a decorated U.S. Marine and veteran who has published two memoirs, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan, and Places and Names on War, Revolution, and Returning. That one on my shelf right this minute, waiting to be read next. Elliot, I just discovered it, or just not discovered it, but just pulled it down and said, hey, it's time. That one I think will be a bit personal for me, and I needed to read it at the right time, and that time is now. We're fortunate to have Elliot join us for the fourth time here on The Ask, this time in conjunction with publication of his latest novel, Halcyon, in which he weaves what I found to be a nuanced web, if I may, of history, contemporary social issues, politics, family, mortality, all of that in a compact but profound 237 pages. And you almost dabbled a little bit there with science fiction, if I may be so bold as to say that. As I was reading, I'm like, this walks right up to the line. With that, Elliot, welcome back to The Ask. Thanks so much for joining us. And if we could lead right on in here, we had you here last time for a discussion about your memoir, The Fifth Act. That was a book that you wrote about real things almost in real time that had to do with America's final withdrawal out of Afghanistan. And we have gone from that to this interview where we're talking a novel, one I'd be willing to put right up there in the category of great American novels for what that's worth coming from this fella here. I burned through it. I loved it as I went through and dropped a note to you just saying, hey, for one, it is so deeply human. And I'd like to talk more as we go through, hopefully explain a little more what those few words meant. But we'd like to open with your thoughts there, a little introduction of the book itself and, that change of venue, really. We've gone from memoir to fiction, which for you is not new. You've gone back and forth. You've written many, many things in many styles. But what's different there for you going from the memoir side over into the novel side again?
Thanks again to you guys for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk. And I, always appreciate how thoughtful you are in these conversations. In my career, I kind of toggle between fiction and nonfiction. I don't see there obviously is a difference between the two, but, I'm kind of focused on storytelling. And so there'll be a story that I want to tell, and then I sort of figure out what is the best medium in which to tell it. So for instance, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan, was about a particular event. So, so it seemed very natural that would be sort of one part memoir, one part almost like contemporaneous history, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Halcyon is, well, first of all, for listeners who might not be familiar with the book, is a novel that really imagines many of the contemporary issues that our society has been grappling with, particularly in the last probably 4 to 5 years since the pandemic, whether they be, social issues around race and gender, questions about America and how we relate to our history. But it recasts those issues in a novel that takes place in an alternate 2004 where Al Gore is president. And the real sort of protagonist of the novel is a man named Robert Abelson. And when we meet him, he is living on his Virginia estate, which he calls Halcyon. And he's a man who, in his own time, was really revered and beloved. He's a hero of the Second World War, a renowned litigator who championed great liberal causes like racial justice, gay rights. And in my alternate 2004, when Gore is president, one of the sort of wrinkles I bake into the book right at the beginning, that this is a 2004 in which, due to the mapping of the human genome, which really occurred in 1999, the Gore administration, as opposed to the Bush administration, has in effect found a cure for death. They figured out how to bring a few people back. And our protagonist, Robert Abelson, is one of these people. So we now see a man who was beloved in his own time, living in an America that is no longer of that time. And we see some of the ways that he's judged, or that judgment awaits him. And so really, it's a book about history. It's a book about how morality evolves in different cultures and society over time. And it's a book about America. And it's a book about the America we all have been living through these last, 5-10 years, but it's just, recast in this sort of alternate America, because sometimes I think it's helpful to take a step away when we ask ourselves, at least a step of distance, we're trying to ask these questions that feel so fraught to us, particularly as Americans.
Elliot, we will say to our readers here, there will probably be some spoilers in this discussion. We want to encourage our listeners to go out, get the book, read it cover to cover, give it the full treatment there, and then come in and listen to our podcast. Our priority really would be put Elliot's book in your hands, read that book, and then come back and then listen to us discussing how it goes. But there will be spoilers if somebody should choose to listen first. Elliot, we've seen in so much of in all of your writing, there are elements of you in it. So even the fiction, you're writing about areas where you have served, conflicts in which you've partaken or been part of. And in this particular novel, I'm assuming that there are parts and pieces there that you refer that are drawn from personally as well. But from what I know of you and your background, it doesn't jump out right at me in terms of we don't have a long personal relationship, so I don't know all the nuance there. Where does this one come from personally? Do you have ties to the area? Do you have ties to the issues? What drove you there?
I would say sort of the most direct personal connection that exists in this novel is my wife, her father and her mother had a pretty significant age difference, about I think it was 28 years. So her father was actually a veteran of the Second World War, and he was in the OSS in World War II. He was actually part of a team that rescued some of the Doolittle Raiders when they were shot down behind enemy lines. So he had this pretty storied World War II career. And then he came back she's from Wilmington, Delaware, came back to Wilmington and then had a second career as a lawyer. And it's just one of these figures. I never met him. Unfortunately, I really wish I had. One of my great regrets in life is I never met him. He passed away in 2008. But one of these figures who's just beloved, not only in her family, but in her community, to the point that, as I became part of that family, there's just a continual refrain that one cannot help but notice anytime, people are talking about current events around the dinner table. And it's sort of, what do you think Daddy would have thought of this? What would Daddy think of X? What would he have thought about Y? And he's spoken about very much as though he is alive all these years later. And so I guess after a while, and particularly sort of during COVID and with all the upheaval that was going on in American life, it was, people often wonder, well, what do you think Daddy would have thought of all this? And it just sort of interested me, this idea of taking a person who was beloved in their time and what it would be like for them to have to walk through a time that isn't their own. So that was just sort of like a general sense. I want to try to tell that story. I don't know how I'm going to tell that story. And, maybe like you guys, I'm a little bit of a history nerd when you put me up against a wall. I've always had a fascination with the Civil War, obviously, and how it features in American life. I mean, it's the Second American Revolution. It's, our understanding of the Civil War says a lot about us as a country and how we've related to those events differently over the decades. But then I was also had always been kind of fascinated by, and I think being fascinated by alternate history is actually something that's sort of distinctly American too. We're always kind of playing these little games. And I think one of the little alternate history games that is, pretty close to contemporary times, in which the nation hit a real kind of fork in the road, was the 2000 election. I mean, I don't think there's any American, who lived through that election who hasn't wondered if, 536 people in Florida had voted differently and Al Gore had become president, would the country sort of gone in a very different direction at a critical time, a year before September 11th. And one of the and when we think about that election, we often think about it in the context of September 11th, which is, as you mentioned, is an event that, affected me personally and so many others. But what we frequently forget is that one of the ways that election had real consequences was in terms of science. And that in 1999, the year before that election was actually the year that the human genome was mapped. And so a little forgotten piece of history is that when the human genome was mapped and the US government immediately started doing pretty aggressive research into what the implications of that would be, particularly around things like cloning animals, cloning body parts, and, for surgery or heart replacement or, all of those types of issues. And when President Bush took office, one of his first things he did was he immediately pulled a lot of the funding for that research based off of his objections that were kind of founded on his religious beliefs and the morality of all of this. And so the book isn't completely about this, but sort of a device that I offer in the first sentence of the book. The first sentence of the book is news of the Great Discovery had leaked out. And the Great Discovery is that the Gore administration, after 4 years of going, pedal to the metal on this research, has figured out how to bring mice back from the dead. But then what you learn very quickly is that they've also figured out how to bring a few people back from the dead. And then that allows us to kind of open up this whole world where you have Robert Abelson, this man who is not my father-in-law, but sort of I imagine him as being a figure kind of like my father-in-law, is suddenly walking around in a world that is not his own. And as I like to say, hijinks then ensue.
That's a perfect segue for, I guess, my follow-up here. Thank you for laying out the central sci-fi premise and the reason for the science fiction at the heart of your novel. And I do want to bring our listeners into your prose. So if you'll excuse me, I'll actually read from a section of your novel for our listeners and also for the framing of the conversation on this podcast. So this is a conversation between the protagonist, Martin Newman, and his colleague, a fellow historian, Lucas Harlow. Those Lazarus mice, right? He answered. Yeah, I read about them. My colleagues in the philosophy department are pretty worked up about it, says Lucas Harlow. Why the philosophy department? Asks Martin. It's the ethics behind this. It's all new and it's caught them off guard. The geneticists, the biologists, they've seen this coming for a while, ever since we mapped the human genome. Lucas took another long pull on his coffee, which he clenched between both hands. When was that? 5 years ago? If you can map out genetic structures, then you can map out cellular ones, which means it isn't so big a step to go from engineering to re-engineering cells. The building blocks have existed for years. Someone's finally put it all together. Geneticists, cytogeneticists, even oncologists, most weren't too surprised to hear about the mice. It's the ethicists, those dinosaurs in philosophy departments, they're the ones who hadn't been watching. They've got no idea how to respond. One day you're resurrecting mice, the next day people. What are the ethical implications? They don't have a clue. And before I mute myself, I guess, one question that I had regarding the framing of the novel, you mentioned that there's two things here. One is the power of science fiction to look into a probable future, right? Here in the context of Halcyon, the idea of bringing back living organisms remains science fiction, but fiction and science fiction have had a grand tradition of highlighting a future that sometimes creeps up on us very quickly. And, to the conversation here, I think of how AI, artificial intelligence, has so dramatically intruded upon our lives over just the last year. So there's that part to it. And I guess the second, I'm curious as to your thoughts on the role of science fiction and fiction as well in terms of that kind of inquiry. So that's part one. And then the second part that I would have here for you is you wanted to take Robert Albison out of his time and then bring him back. And what I find very interesting about the way the novel is structured is that he's actually not gone for very long. But even in that brief absence, him coming back is so disruptive for himself and those around him. And I'm wondering, why treat time like that within the context of your novel structure?
So thanks, Wise. I think the first part of that question is sort of about like science fiction. It comes fundamentally down to like just, I think, storytelling. Like, why do we tell ourselves stories? And I think the reason we tell ourselves stories is it's a means by which we take our incredibly complex reality and we put it into an order that is understandable for us. One of, I think, the themes that is studied throughout Halcyon is this idea of history itself and human progress. Are we progressing along a line, or is it the sort of old, I think I quoted in the book, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. I think I have someone misquoting it. They like flip it around. But that idea that we're yes, there's blips here and there, but we're always going in generally the right direction. Is that true? And I think there's a very healthy debate to be had around that. And so, we're kind of talking about AI today, right? Like artificial intelligence is very much sort of, what are the ethical implications of it? How is it going to transform our society? But what's the movie that everyone's going out to see this weekend? Because we're talking on, the opening weekend of Barbieheimer. Well, it's Barbie, but it's also Oppenheimer. So why does a movie about Robert Oppenheimer and the splitting of the atom resonate so much right now? And it's because we've sort of seen this story before, at least from an ethical point of view. And it's an unspoken, but clearly direct analog between Oppenheimer and AI that is going on in that film. So I think that is sort of the purpose of stories and why you pick stories is you're making analogs. You're telling a story that can resonate in many different ways. Now with regards to like sort of the timeline in Halcyon that he's not dead for long. For me, that's sort of common. I could have had it been 20 years, but it was sort of my sort of just trying to be subtle commentary on how quickly things change. If you went to bed in 2015 and you woke up in 2021, I would argue the world looked very, very different in those 5 years. And when you're living through periods of accelerated change, I mean, the difference between a handful of years is really significant. One of the ways I actually see it, have seen it, is with my parents' generation. That's the generation older than me. Is like the difference if you meet someone who was born in like 1939 and 1940 versus someone who was born in 1945 is very, very different. One is a member sort of the silent generation. They kind of lived through the 50s, maybe got married in the early 60s. And the other generation are the ones who are sort of the baby boomer love children. So there can be like these really big schisms that exist. And I think that's why it felt like the right call to have Robert Abelson gone for just a short amount of time and then brought back in something he feels is pretty unrecognizable.
I think that Wise hit on something that jumped out at me on that, as well as that short span. I don't even know if you would characterize the book yourself as science fiction. I said, like, Amazon doesn't list it that way, for example, in that. But it's why I said in the beginning, it kind of walks right up to that line. There's this underlying thread. But what you did here as I was reading through it, Elliot, was you took that major scientific thing and wove it into life, family, some very basic decisions and implications about living to pass things on to the next generations and those. And I found it fascinating that such a major science breakthrough was woven in as almost just another thing happening in the story. That to me was kind of where I started going, this is very human. Like, this is about, there's two, say it's not stepsons that kind of have a complicated relationship with the new dad who's got that beloved history that's much different than their own father, and then there's the daughter who is the progeny of the two main character of the Abelsons and has a much different relationship. So all of that very human thing was happening there. And Elliot, in contrast, I mean, you have like other books that deal with the time part. So like Eric Flint in his 1632 series, not sure if you're familiar or not, but a tech accident takes a whole bubble of Virginia and drops it in the middle of 1632, and it changes everything. And it's a series of books that really explore that. The Man in the High Castle, Philip K. Dick, really takes a look at some subtle changes and things. But there, Harry Turtledove, Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clark deals more with like magical changes in the background. And the implication of those is this little thing changes and everything changes. What you talked about there was over a short period of time, there was significant change for Abelson. Like over a short span of time, how he was even looked at. The things he did with good intention were looked at or characterized in a different way. And yet there's an implication, I think, in your book that Gore was president and then W came on in, but still did some of the things W did. And we move on in, and there's, President Obama makes an appearance there, and then Hillary Clinton pulled in. But the implication I left with at the end was we were headed for a Trump presidency. It wasn't said. And it certainly wasn't a political book in that sense from what I was reading of it. But it seemed like you were saying almost even these little changes, maybe not. Maybe they're not really going to take us too far off. And I'm curious about your thinking there, and I don't want to have you tell me as the author, like, was I right or wrong and how I interpreted it? But I'm curious of your thought there, of that implication of a major change that was really just part of life in the background.
I was doing a book reading, and they're like, but people they found out that we have defeated death. Like, and these people are just living their lives as though nothing has profoundly changed. I mean, no, that wouldn't happen. And I'm like, I beg to differ. I'm like, absolutely it would. Are you kidding me? Like, we've just this year, like, woken up to a world in which robots are going to completely replace us and are going to be smarter than us. And we're just sort of like, you want to go see Barbie? Like, I mean, like, so I think, if there's one thing I feel like I've just sort of observed as a human, and actually, this kind of comes through, like, I think it's something I just learned almost in the military, is our ability as human beings to like see and experience just sort of totally shattering, loss or politics or upheavals, but the relentlessness of just like, well, got to get up and have my breakfast, and keep going, like, is pretty amazing. Like, actually, like, the wheels don't fall off the bus. Like, we just sort of keep going. Life is just sort of relentless in that way. And so I think, listen, anytime you're writing a story, you've got choices you got to make, and they just present themselves to you in the writing of the story. So as I'm getting to the end of the Halcyon, Halcyon it's not a book about the politics, and it's not a book that's like all about the science and really getting into those things are sort of happening in the background. It's a book about this family, and it's a book about a couple controversies that come up in the life of this man, Robert Abelson. And it's a book that, at least structurally speaking, it's not narrated by Abelson. It's narrated by Martin Newman, this sort of down on his luck historian who's living in the guest house at Halcyon. And sort of, Martin Newman is like the Nick Carraway to Robert Abelson's Great Gatsby. So when we meet Abelson, he's sort of a little bit of a mysterious figure that Newman kind of was looking up to, because Newman is not a guy who's had he's not someone who's beloved in his community, who's revered. He's not a war hero. He is a divorcee who is like an associate professor of history who cannot seem to write his first book. So this is not a guy that everyone is, that people offer thunderous applause to all the time. But what we start to see is that Abelson isn't everything that he sees, and he's more complex. But back to your point, as the story kind of goes on, you realize, there's some questions that need answering. And this election is playing out in the background. And it's basically in 2004, it's Gore's reelection. Is he going to get reelected? And I have to decide, is he going to get reelected? And to me, it seemed more compelling that no, he wouldn't. And that, Bush would come in and kind of life would sort of take on its just sort of relentless momentum. There's nothing that I would say authoritatively trying to say in making that choice, only in that choice to me felt right. It felt more true than a choice that Gore would win a second time and we would suddenly be delivered into this like American utopia or whatever, that the world would suddenly be radically different. Because I think that as much as we're obsessed with these alternate histories, we humans have an amazing capacity to just kind of repeat all of our own dysfunction over and over and over again. So I don't necessarily believe that history is like this unrelenting march of progress. I think we're often, it's the old kind of cliche, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And so I wanted to try to come up with an ending that would rhyme with present day. And my rhyming present day is a lot of the things that exist politically and scientifically in America today go on to exist in my future universe. Just the past is a little bit different.
Gosh, I hope you're wrong, Elliot. There's nothing more terrifying to think that the arc of history doesn't, in fact, move towards justice and, in fact, rhymes and the wheels turn and we often end up where we were a moment ago.
I think we wind up with both Wise. I think we wind up with, listen, there has never been a time in the history of the universe where it's better to be a human being than today, just in terms of longevity, the quality of our lives, penicillin, all these things. So that is definitely true, but it coexists with incredible suffering, with, we're talking about Oppenheimer, with the fact that the species can now wipe itself out and, and wars across the globe. So that's, it's the mix, it's the good and the bad, the duality of man, which I think is an infinitely interesting subject.
And it leads to an opportunity in all of this to throw George Carlin in and his take on the world. And that, his argument at one point along the way was, no, we're not going to destroy the world. The world essentially doesn't care. We might destroy ourselves, but, the world just keep on spinning and be fine. But, Elliot, I found it fascinating as well that in the background of the story, you had the underlying historical question of the death of General Jackson. And I hope I got my history right on that one. That was an underlying piece there of, the two historians in the book talking about had he not died, had he been at Gettysburg, would he have seen the battle differently? Would everything have changed? And I loved that there was that parallelism going on there, of that discussion of that one significant moment that could have changed everything, and them having that ongoing discussion about what could have, would have, should have changed. And yet that bigger premise overall that maybe not. Maybe it would have still kind of gone the same way, and we would have ended up pretty much where your book ended, regardless, as we go through there. And Wise, what else is on your mind there?
Well, I was just interested in something that you brought up, Elliot, and I'm just curious as to the importance or the influence of it on your latest novel. And you mentioned how one of your beliefs is that history has a rhyme to it. And certainly elements of Halcyon rhymes with what's considered one of the great American novels, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. You, in fact, call out your protagonist, Martin Newman, as a Nick Carraway type figure. And there are definitely, analogs throughout your novel with The Great Gatsby in the way of Nick Carraway living in proximity to a great man. living in a great house and then being caught up in the turmoil of that figure's life. And I'm wondering, was that very purposeful on your part? And just curious to hear about, Fitzgerald's influence on this book, whether it may be true or not.
No, actually, it wasn't, in so much as I actually read a reviewer mention that structure. And I was like, oh yeah, of course, he's totally right. That's exactly what I did. When I structured the book that way, I was not like, okay, I'm going to do it like Gatsby, boom, with the sort of, the secondhand narrator. But clearly that's what I did. And I'm sure the reason I probably did it is because I've read The Great Gatsby a bunch of times. So as a writer, you don't always know why you're making the decisions that you're making. You're just sort of feeling out what feels right. And and I listen, every writer is a reader. And like you guys, I read a ton. And so when I'm trying to figure out the problem of a story, okay, what am I going to put in here? How am I going to tell it that feels true and allows me to kind of cover the ground I want to cover? Narratively speaking, you start making those choices. And so one for me was like, all right, Robert Abelson's not going to tell this story. Who's going to tell it? It's going to be someone watching the family. And this is, these are sort of like craft questions, but because if I have an omniscient point of view, I can't withhold secrets as a writer, right? So I need there to be secrets that are revealed through the story, which there are. So I need someone standing who doesn't know the secrets, and then he will learn those secrets. So it's like, okay, so someone who's, just a little bit off to the side, and that lends itself to that type of a narrator. But then sort of after the fact, I'm like, yes, clearly that's what happens. I think that's what happens with any art. Like it's a great interview. I remember watching it, and it was someone was asking like Bob Dylan, not that I'm Bob Dylan, but like someone was asking Bob Dylan, like, how did you write How Many Roads Must a Man Walk Down before you'll call him a man? And he's like, where did that come from? And he's like, if you'd listened to as much country music as I've listened to, you'll just write that lyric. So I think a lot of this stuff just comes out of like the layering all the stories that you've had. That novel, obviously, The Great Gatsby, looms large in the canon of American literature, and I've read it many times, starting when I was, a boy in school.
For the record, Cliff chooses your novel over The Great Gatsby in terms of the weight of it. We had a discussion before this interview, so I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Undoubtedly a product of my time there. I absolutely recognize the genius behind The Great Gatsby, and but I just, as I read through, I came away going like, yeah, I get it. Yeah. And then, but not that it's my place at all to critique F. Scott Fitzgerald. Definitely the parallels there, but in reading through Halcyon, it was just simply more relevant to me today, and I came away feeling very good about it overall. Take a bit of a weird stretch here. When we talk about living forever, you go back through. In fact, what you've got behind me is the fiction section. My nonfiction's all downstairs. And on these shelves, then you have, there's some elves, there's some vampires. There's a little bit of Heinlein, Lazarus Long, which is, a fellow who, lived essentially forever. So much of what explores that is either in the fantastic and, Elric Meldemonet as well. The, Michael Moorcock, I guess, has a guy there that's living forever. He wrestles with it in a bit of a dark way, with the question of like, why do I really want to live forever? But again, you brought it down just into a family, into day to day, and had that question in there of, do we want to? Abelson wanted to keep living, and I warned of spoilers before. His wife in this one, when she came to her time, she chose no, and that to me was a very profound and powerful thing as well. I'm curious about where you were, where your interest in exploring that question was. And then if we could take it personal, we could go right to you. Would you want to live forever? If this was an option, would you take it?
Well, there's a great quote by Kafka that I love, where he says, the meaning of life is that it ends. Right. And if it doesn't, and what creates value? I mean, just like almost economically speaking, what creates value? Like scarcity. If there's no scarcity, there is no value. If there's a resource, if it's, gold or whatever it is that, and if it exists in infinite amounts, it has no value. So if you live forever, time then has no scarcity. So I think at a certain, like just philosophical level, it would take some of the meaning away from life and take some of the sweetness away from life. I'm like, I'm sure, I don't know if you guys have children, like I have children, and who, as I mentioned, are like in the next room. And I love being with my children. One of the things that's very poignant to me is I love being with them, because I also can recognize like these years are precious, because they'll go away and they're all going to be grown up here before I know it. And it makes it so much more valuable. So at the same time, I think the allure, right, of living forever is that you never have to endure loss. So you yourself don't have to say goodbye, and the people around you might never have to say goodbye. But I think it would fundamentally alter what the feeling of life is. I mean, what makes life so precious is that it's finite. But that is, that's sort of a question that comes up between Abelson and his wife. And it comes up immediately because, in the opening of the book, you realize that even though he is much older than she is, she's the one who's sick. And it becomes very disorienting for him to he's going to live forever, but when he made the decision to try to live forever, never had to consider that her life would become finite. And I'm saying too, and and the other thing is loss. I mean, we all hate loss, but like at the end of the day, like loss also defines life. So, I don't think the book, I hope the book doesn't skew too heavy, but I wanted some of these questions to sort of come up naturally in the narrative, because I think they cause us to sort of just ask questions about the aspects of our life that we probably don't think about. We don't think about how everything is finite, particularly time in life. So I don't know. So I didn't give you a binary answer. I think my answer is I'd probably have to have a really hard think about it. I wrote a whole novel about it, so I'm kind of on both sides of the issue.
I think it's fantastic you didn't give us the binary in that case. That we'd have a whole discussion about that one over drinks sometime, I'm sure.
Yeah, I wonder what it says about me that if I did have the power to stop time for my father and mother, I would, and keep them here with me forever. So it is a very powerful literary and philosophical device that you use in your novel. And going back to your objective not to write a polemic, and I think you even spoke about this in a previous interview regarding Halcyon. If you were interested in writing about the Me Too movement or, the Black Lives Matter movement or the debate regarding Confederate monuments, you would have done so in, an opinion piece that would have appeared in the New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. It's not really your overall intent to make this a political novel. Ultimately, it's about, as you said, this man, his family, and this historian that gets caught up in the storm of events. But what I do find interesting is that, again, at the center of your novel is this young woman, Janet Templeton, who believes that Robert Abelson ruined her life and her mother's life through his either overt, deliberate, or oblivious harm that he caused them as she was growing up. And so she files a devastating legal case against Robert Abelson and his family and lays claim basically to his entire inheritance. And that serves as a dramatic through line throughout the book, this contest between Janet and Robert Abelson and his family. And at every legal turn to secure the future of his family, the past has to die. Now, Mary had cancer. The reason why she chose death over life or over an extension of life was to save their house. And she even says in the novel, Janet will never get this home. And then you fast forward to that second moment of crisis. And again, dear listeners, we really hope you've read the novel prior to this interview. Robert too has to go away a final time in order to save the future of his family. And I'm wondering, is that kind of where you arrive on in terms of us as an author, or in terms of your argument regarding the past and the future? In order for us to move forward, the past has to, in some ways, pass away or die.
Well, I think the obvious question becomes, and it happens with Robert, and it happens socially, and it happens at the family level too, is this question of whose time is it? And I'm sure you guys have experiences just as you age. I recognize this now. Like, I have many friends of mine from like teenagers or even my 20s who are now, in their 40s, and many of them have got like really interesting big jobs doing fascinating things in the world, and it's their time. They're supposed to be doing that. Now they've got their hands on the wheel, and 20 years ago they didn't, and in 20 years they probably won't, because they will have handed that off to another generation. So the idea that if life becomes infinite, or if all opinions become set, all cultural norms become set, does that inhibit that natural handing off of time from one generation to another, of one generation saying it was our time, now it's your time? And, and it's probably raises questions in political life today, as we're like hurtling towards a presidential election. I mean, who knows what will happen, but like two of the major party nominees are, very old. Much has been written like, hey, isn't it time to pass the baton? How long do people hold on? And is it always right to hold on that long? Or do you start hurting people by holding on for too long? Sometimes you just got to let go. I would say to kind of, associate this with something cultural, like, do you guys see Top Gun 2 Maverick?
Yeah.
It's like a part of that movie that just like, we could talk about that movie on a whole podcast, but like a part of that movie that just killed me was this moment when Maverick goes to see Iceman, and I don't know if you know, like Val Kilmer in real life has had this like devastating throat cancer, but they bring him out for it. And actually there's a very poignant moment where like Val Kilmer says to him, like, sometimes you just got to let go, because it felt to me, that felt very meta. It felt like these two actors who had this like pretty incredible moment, I'm sure, when they were young. And now they're sitting there in this remake of their kind of first big movie. And one is telling the other, like, hey, sometimes you just got to let go. So that felt very meta to me. So I wasn't expecting to bring Top Gun 2 Maverick into this conversation, but I think there are always these questions of, when is the right and graceful time for someone to let go? And we see that happen frequently, like, or even, watching, I don't know if you guys are tennis enthusiasts, but I love Wimbledon. And I was watching the Wimbledon final a week ago, and it was this incredible 5-hour tennis match between Novak Djokovic, arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest player who ever lived, and this young guy, Carlos Alcaraz. And so much of the subtext of this match, which Alcaraz won, was, is this the moment where Djokovic is going to be forced to let go and lose at Wimbledon, is what made it so poignant. So I think those questions of when people choose to let go are very weighted and can often be extremely poignant to me. And there are certainly a few of them embedded throughout the novel.
There certainly are. You also hit, this is a terrible transition, bad segue, but you also in there addressed, like, I'm setting myself up for failure by declaring my next segue poor. Speaking of airplanes, there's a obscure Bob Newhart reference there. Talking about that point at which you transition, that point at which you let go, there is also then that tie then to the absolutes, the binary, that my past is mine, my history is mine, what's the right? And then you do play in the novel there to the two historians, one of whom says, history is no good to us if we're not looking forward from it. And then the main character, Martin, he's like, wait, what? No, history's about looking back. That's what it is. And I guess I want to kind of take this back to what's the author think on this as well, because there's this fascinating binary going on there, while at the same time, even Martin, in exploring this, is talking about the importance of looking for compromise, the importance of not being polarized. And yet when he falls into his own field of expertise, he's almost absolute, like, no, this is what history is. It's looking back. Let's take a couple minutes, if you're willing there, Elliot, and explore that a bit. And I'd like to hear, in fact, where, do you have an opinion on that particular piece on, where's the gray?
I always aspire to write the types of books that I enjoy to read, and the types of books I enjoy to read, when I finish the last page, hopefully I'm like, whoa, that was great. Mm-hmm. And I start asking myself all these questions. Like, what about this? What about that? Oh, that's interesting. And the book will often help me frame questions. So to me, novels are usually about questions and framing questions, and they're less about answers. And so in the course of writing a novel, I will create a whole cast of characters that will step onto the stage. The stage is basically the page in this case, and they will make their case in front of the readers, or they're making their case before God. This is the world, and this is how I see it. And maybe you do or do not see it the same way. So there are many characters in the novel that have different views about what history is. They have different views on this sort of central controversy in the novel, which is a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield called the Virginia Monument, which is a huge monument of Robert E. Lee that on the battlefield is right where Pickett's charge began. And as you'll notice in the novel, I have that monument torn down. In reality, that monument is still there. So that's sort of a play with the historical narrative. But I think I think the reality is it's both. Like there is no answer. Listen, history is about two things. It's about facts and it's about narratives. Now, I don't think in history you can have different facts. Like the facts are the facts. Like if it happened, it happened. But then people will argue about what the facts mean, what they meant at the moment, what they mean going forward. I think the Civil War is fascinating because what was the Civil War really about? Has been sort of this question of debate in American life that has often defined American life. The idea that for such a long time, one of the dominant narratives, in the South was, they call it the War of Northern Aggression. And this was, of course, slavery was the issue, but it was really about states' rights and what are the rights of the states. And obviously, the Northern view is, what do you mean this is about states' rights? It's about slavery. It's about abolishing slavery. And then you look at the contemporaneous writings of, Abraham Lincoln, and in his own mind during the war, it became about different things. I think sometimes there is a view that there is a right answer. No, there is the right answer. This is what it was about. I've never subscribed to that. I'm like, listen, the fact that you have two groups of people and there's an issue they have violent disagreement about, and they can't agree what this war they're fighting is even about. Like, they can't even agree what the war is about. Like, well, that's why they're fighting the war. If everybody agreed what the war was about, you probably wouldn't be fighting a war about it. So then, one side wins, and typically its narrative about what the war was really about becomes the dominant narrative, and the people who lose, they live with, their narrative being sustained by the narrative of the victors. But the fact that people are having the debates about the narratives, I think, around history will always go on and on and on. I think the one thing that, you can't debate are just like the facts, but of course people do debate the facts. So, and it's a novel that, that kind of, again, asks all these questions, and I've created characters that that inhabit different points of view on the question of, history and narrative versus fact.
I have a follow-up to that. I was listening to you, Elliot. I think one thing that's very interesting about choosing, because I was talking about this with Cliff before, our interview here, and I asked Cliff, why the Civil War out of all the devices you could have chosen as a lens to talk about something that has shaped American history for most of this nation's existence. And I think, and it kind of goes back to, elements of your novel, and it's something that I can't really understand, having not lived in the milieu, but it is hard. There's half of our country that lost the Civil War, arguably. And growing up in that culture, you have to sort of find a way of navigating that defeat and that guilt and making it okay for yourself and your family and your descendants and your ancestors. And I think it has, you hint at the novel, and certainly what a lot of thinkers continue to write about today, it shaped our modern politics, that the past. So it is interesting how the past may be long behind us, it may be dead, but it really does still live amongst us in surprising ways.
Well, I think one of the things that is fascinating just about America. Well, first of all, I think intuitively, I'm infinitely fascinated by the Civil War. So that's one of the reasons, I'm sort of like an amateur Civil War nerd, and have read extensively about it and been to all these battlefields that are in the book many times. But if you look at, the history of America, of all of the crossroads that American life comes to, there's none greater than the Civil War, where the country could have gone in two just really violently, very, very different directions. The path not taken is one in which the nation basically would have dissolved. But that America is actually a revolutionary society. Like, we live in, like, at least like Trotsky would define it, for instance, like a revolutionary society. America's constantly going through revolutions. Many of them, the majority of them, are not violent. And like, for instance, I work as a journalist too, and covered the Civil War in Syria for many years. And one of the things I learned very early on was how when you would sit down with someone, for instance, who in Syria, who was fighting or aligned with the Free Syrian Army, which were those that were against the government of Assad. And I would say to them, well, tell me about where you were when the Civil War began in Syria. There was Civil War. What are you talking about? This is not a civil war. You need to understand, this is a revolution in our country. Mm-hmm. Conversely, when you would sit down with someone who was sympathetic to the regime and say to them, the revolution's been going on for 2 years. How does Assad think he's going to enter? Whoa, 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 whoa. This is not a revolution. This is a civil war. You need to understand that. So even the idea of, if we look at and the Southerners would say this, they sort of viewed the U.S. Civil War as a second American Revolution. Mm-hmm. And I only bring that up in the context of, like, American society has these revolutions that have occurred all through it. We can call them civil wars or whatever you want to call it. A civil war and a revolution are often very adjacent to one another. But typically in American life, we have a form of government that allows us to metabolize those types of revolutions over the years in a way that many other governments don't. So we as Americans, right, we think of ourselves, I think, just intrinsically, like, oh, well, we're this very young nation. When you look at us compared to Europe or China, we're such a young people as we Americans. And culturally, that's true. Culturally, we are a young people. But when you look at our form of government, which has basically existed without interruption since 1776, mm-hmm. or we could start with, the Constitutional Convention, more than 200 years, point to a nation that has had the same form of government that long. They're very, very few. I mean, look in Europe, the Germans don't, the French don't. Maybe the Brits, but that's about it. And you got other parts of the world, absolutely not. And in that way, we're actually a very old nation. So we're a very old nation on the one hand, but culturally we're very young. And I think that schism creates very interesting moments in American life And it's, and one of the reasons I feel like the Civil War is just sort of the big daddy of those revolutionary / moments of great civil strife in American society. But we're always having these little shock waves where there's sort of minor revolutions that exist in American society that our form of government, despite all of its problems, has at least thus far been able to metabolize.
I think you hit something there. I think I probably tried to take credit for in 8th grade, I think, when I became the young genius who knew everything, and certainly more than my parents at the time. But that phrase that had we lost the revolution, it would have been a civil war. Had we lost the Civil War, it would have been a revolution. And that those views, so often you do have two dominant views, two dominant polar views. And then somewhere in those becomes sort of the gray and the convergence of ideas and the mishmash in there of the Venn diagram overlap or the bell curve center or something like that. But you have these extremes battling against each other in some sort of way.
That's right. And you said it more eloquently than I could. I mean, absolutely. And that gets to what we were talking about before, which is history. History, that difference of, if you lose the Civil War, it's a revolution. And if you win the revolution, it's a civil war. Gets down to, that's a narrative question. But the fact that there was a war on these dates is a fact.
Yeah, indeed. Elliot, we're coming up on time. In fact, we've crashed right up against the end of the hour with us here, which I had hoped to not do. But it does take us to a point where we can still exit gracefully without smushing our time up too much by saying thank you. And to our listeners, we are here with Elliot Ackerman, who's an award-winning and best-selling novelist and nonfiction writer. And he shared time with us here for a 4th time, which is probably bothers you to hear. I wouldn't be surprised, but it's an honor, Elliot, that you took your time out of your schedule. Time being finite in our world right now, and therefore precious. It is valuable to us that you chose to invest this time with us, and I want to thank you for that. And on that, from my perspective, I want to share that if you write for the intent of leaving a reader saying, huh, and asking questions and saying, wow, you accomplished that with me, with Halcyon. And I came away with all of these questions and more. And I truly appreciated that when I closed that book after reading it, I came away feeling like I hadn't been told to think, feel, believe anything. I had been given questions that were not clearly answered, questions that needed more exploration. And I appreciated that as a reader. So thank you for that. Mission accomplished there when it comes to your stated intent as an author. And thank you for that. And then I tend to like to close with, what did we miss? What do you wish we had asked? What do you wish we had raised and put on the table? And give Elliot the chance to close out. Wise, if you're comfortable with that form of egress.
That sounds like a good idea, Cliff. And you make a good point. We could keep Elliot here for another 2 hours and not be done with all the questions that, we had lined up after reading your novel. So I'm glad that you were like, hey, we got to take the hour. I guess my last question for you, Elliot, and it's a very simple question. This novel could have been named many different things. It could have been named Lazarus. It could have been named, Robert Abelson. It could have been named the Great Shelby Foot Debate of 2023. Why Halcyon?
Because Halcyon refers to an idealized moment in the past, a moment that maybe once existed, but maybe only existed in our imaginations, and how we've rendered a past that maybe never even was. So it's the name of Robert Abelson's estate. It seemed like an apt and succinct title for the novel. But I guess in my closing remarks, I would just say too, I think if you're sort of our vintage reader, maybe if you've lived through any of the early 2000s, you'll also find that there are lots of little nuggets from life back then that are included in the book as well. So I think it's a book that poses lots of questions, but I also think and hope it's a fun read.
Absolutely. Elliot, a novel on par with The Great Gatsby, and in my humble opinion, far more relevant to me personally as a piece of work. And I thank you for it.
Speaking of history, Elliot, I consider your participation in this small podcast a part of the history of the Ask, and I could not be more grateful that an author of your stature makes the time to appear on this podcast. I guess my final question for you, Elliot, is where are you going next as an author? And I'm curious if you could maybe show a little bit of the cards in your hand.
So the next book that I will have coming out will be in March of 2024, will be the novel 2054, which is the sequel to the novel I wrote with Admiral Jim Stavridis about a war with China in the year 2034. So that is now going to be a trilogy. And so the second part of the trilogy that comes out next year 2054 imagines a civil crisis in the United States precipitated by the assassination of an American president. And the book also deals with artificial intelligence and the integration, biological and technological, and evolution, what we call the singularity. So it's a fast-paced thriller all about civil war in the U.S. and technology.
Now that I know it's a trilogy, I have to wait to read 2034, which I just put on my shelf because I'm that kind of reader. I'd rather read them all at once. So,
we here at The Ask would like to thank New York Times bestselling author Elliot Ackerman for making the time to join us and discuss his work in Halcyon, a haunting novel about death, life, family, and how the past is either torn down or raised up to serve us in the present. Halcyon is available through Penguin Random House at digital and physical bookstores everywhere. We encourage our listeners to seek out this book and discover Halcyon's secrets for themselves.